Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the International Cannabis Conversation. My name is Chris Day, co-founder of the Global Cannabis Network Collective, and your international travel guide as we tour the world and talk to people who are making moves in the international cannabis markets. Today, I really want to first thank trichomes.com for letting us host this fun show every week, and I want to welcome somebody that is really busy, been trying to get him on for several weeks, and we've got him today. Ed McDermott, the co-founder of EMMAC Life Sciences, the CEO of Fast Forward. Fast Forward is a venture capital fund based in Guernsey. Invest in tech, biotech, blockchain, and of course, medical cannabis. So Ed, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Chris. It's really good to be able to get together. And thanks for bearing with me. It's been a busy old time.
Yeah, no, before we came on, I was just commenting, between the first time we were trying to get on and record and now you've made some additional moves. So I think it works in our favor in this case to have postponed a couple of weeks. I always like to start out talking a little bit about the people behind the companies, and you've got quite the background, and so I thought it might be interesting first to start out just sort of telling listeners who is Ed McDermott and how did he end up looking so heavily into the medical cannabis space as a major area of investment for you.
Thanks, Chris. Your introduction was really kind. For me personally, I came into the cannabis sector specifically through being very involved with a lot of North American investors, to be honest. That's really how we really kind of got involved in the sector in the first place. They were obviously so much further ahead than us. It was something that was on our radar. I'm personally, and there's zero judgment towards those who are certainly from an adult use perspective, or medical for that matter, but I'm not a user, so it wasn't like I was an early adopter who really loved the product, but I did have some personal experiences. My kid brother died of a brain tumor when he was just 16 and I was around 19 at the time. And I do recall in the sort of final weeks of his life, and indeed going through all this horrific chemotherapy and radiotherapy that he had to go through. He had the high dose version of both, which is really quite debilitating. And a lot of the time we had to give him Valium, which, is a great product in the right setting, but there is this kind of thing where I always thought during it, I thought, God, if only there was something that was a little more tolerable, didn't sort of just knock you out, didn't sort of allow you not to kind of live your life, and just compounded upon the kind of issues that you were already experiencing from the treatment and the illness itself. And similarly, my grandmother had Parkinson's, and again, I just felt the same way. There must be a more natural alternative that doesn't have sort of all these horrific side effects. And look, it may have been something that could have been used in conjunction, and it just would have been nice had we been in this day and age to, alleviate some of that suffering and allow a more livable life despite the kind of bleak illnesses that those people who were very close to me were going through. So that's one thing I always felt about the product, and it was of major interest. I'd obviously seen in a big way people going towards sort of plant-based foods and sort of more holistic therapies, and that's what really attracted me to cannabis. And of course, being a capital markets guy, I knew that it was a proposition that investors would like.
Yeah, it's interesting. Recently at the GCNC, we just put together a panel of scientists from all around the world to help me, frankly, keep track of all the different research and medicinal innovations going on in cannabis. And I found so often that it's either a personal or family story that becomes the evidence where there is lack of evidence in some places for people to say, hey, this is actually real and we all should pay attention. I'm pleased to see over the last, especially 5 or so years, huge amounts of clinical trials relative to the past coming into the space. But we squashed the conversation for over a century, and now we're having to remind ourselves of things that at least partially we already knew. So it's in spite of the tragedies, I'm happy to see that these types of stories are helping to drive investments for good.
Yeah, the amount of anecdotal stories I think that we all, one way or another have seen with our very own eyes. It's certainly at this point in absence of that clinical data that we also desperately need to see and support. I've seen a number of guys, and again, I'm not making any claims here, but certainly I know a couple of men in their 40s who both had very, very advanced bowel cancer, and those guys are still here 7 or 8 years later. They should have been dead a long time ago, and certainly they both attribute the fact that they were using medical cannabis. Granted, it was all illegally sourced, but it was all quite advanced in the way that they were taking it. They sort of had the people who were creating this product illegally were doing it in a kind of I suppose a philanthropic way. They weren't like charging these guys; they were genuinely trying to help, and that was a beautiful thing to see. But it's amazing that these guys are still here and living on pretty well and going about the stuff that they enjoy doing. So
it's a really exciting time for all of that, and I know as I talk to people around the world, especially in Europe, the advances in the approach to the medicinal side of cannabis, I find very heartening. You made a comment in your intro, and I've got a couple of questions that I wrote down that I want to get to, but before I get to those, I have to bite. So on a comment you made about American investors at the time being far ahead. And now, it's been several years later and markets have continued to progress around the world. Do you still feel that's the case, or do you feel, based on sort of the changing dynamics around the world, that perhaps America is losing its leadership position, as you mentioned it?
I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. And funny enough, this is a conversation I'm having very, very frequently with people because of my experience in capital markets, and I'm far from saying that I'm a genius. I'm just somebody that happens to have experienced a lot of listings, a lot of RTOs, a lot of placings. I've been involved on both the company side and the capital markets side as a broker. So, I've seen how all these things come together. The really interesting thing about it is I keep getting European companies saying to me, we're talking to this NASDAQ company and they think that we could be a great thing. And I'm saying, look, here's the facts. If you go to NASDAQ right now, you're going to be valued as like a wholesale cannabis company. And guess what? Your revenues are not going to be a patch on what they want to see. Therefore, your valuation is going to be terrible. It's not going to include any value whatsoever for your R&D that you're doing, which is, by the way, where the real value of your company is going to be in the years to come. So, if you really want a capital market solution, I don't want to be a cheerleader for the UK specifically, but what are your options? Well, you've got the UK, you've got some of the sort of exchanges in Europe, Frankfurt, whatever, which are good exchanges, but they don't have the critical mass, and really nor does the UK, but at least there people will embrace what you're doing, and they won't. We're at this point now where they'll still look at blue sky, which I think is an unusual thing for the UK, because normally we would be looking at what's your revenue, how many times EBITDA are we going to give you, but obviously this is a novel industry. So it's definitely the US now. Every time I talk to guys in the US, what they're really interested in is what's your revenue, how many times revenue can we give you as a multiple, what's the profile looking like, that trajectory looking like, and that will dictate what your sort of how many X revenue we're going to give you. And it's kind of a shame because now there seems to be really very, very little impetus on funding any kind of research, developing anything that might look like a market authorized drug. And I think there is a sort of somewhat of a halfway house between the GW model and the kind of wholesale medical, cannabis provider. But one thing I must give credit here to Curaleaf, who obviously bought EMMAC, because they've still been supportive of all of those things. So they're clearly a forward-looking organization. I also happen to think that they are financially sophisticated beyond anybody else I've seen in the sector, and I think that's something that's lacking in the leadership of a lot of the biggest companies out there still. And I can say this now as on the side of effectively being a capital provider for the sector, but yeah, it is disappointing that there's no one really leading the charge on major R&D in the States or Canada for that matter. There's a bit still, so we have to acknowledge that, but nowhere near as much as there should be.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, so I'm physically based in Denver, Colorado, and I love it here, and I love the fact that you can talk about cannabis companies and research and all of this here very openly and freely. But it's clear to me, as I talk to folks elsewhere, that the U.S. is, at least for the time being, not where it's at in terms of investment. So I've been watching a lot of what's going on in Europe, and to that and to your comment, I think historically, if we can say there is such a thing in cannabis, right? Let's just say over the last 7 or 8 years, right? There's been a lack of due diligence, but in any kind of real way. But the moves I've seen you make just in the last couple of months, say with Little Green Pharma out of Perth, and as they bought the facility in Denmark, and then this new deal I saw announced, I think, just last week with Urox. You mentioned Blue Sky, and I think there is still some of that, but these are pretty sound companies with smart folks running finance and, I think solid business plans. How are you all going about the process of due diligence and really uncovering those nuggets that you're really after?
I think for us, because certainly in my case, Alfredo, who we recently hired,
and full disclosure, a former colleague of mine, so I should probably thank him for bringing us together. So,
yeah, Alfredo's great. For a guy who's been more on not an operational guy, so to speak. He knows, and I've said this before, and this is not just me trying to kind of big him up. Like he's employed, right? I don't need to do that anymore. He's reasonably well remunerated, but ultimately he brings a level of understanding that I still don't see from the vast majority of management teams that I meet who are claiming that they're hugely experienced in the cannabis sector. So Alfredo is a force to be reckoned with in terms of his knowledge, his attention to detail, and more broadly his understanding of the market. I come at it obviously from kind of both sides of the rails in terms of having really experienced the operational build-up from nothing to a sort of multinational organization with physical operations in a number of different countries, and all that sort of different cultures, all the different cultural awareness that you have to embrace in order to operate in these territories. So there's an element of trying to understand that, and having lived it, that's obviously a major benefit to us. Of course, there's all the usual financial due diligence, which you would expect of any level of company nowadays, with people that understand how to run a business, what needs to be done in that respect. But really, the key thing for me is we generally know very, very quickly when talking to management teams whether they really understand not only the broader market but their own market, because luckily we've had exposure to so many of these European markets now, and of course there aren't that many, so it's
Right.
thankfully there's only X amount of knowledge that we have to gain, and it's going to become harder as more and more markets open up to be as proficient with the due diligence, but it still takes a lot of time. And I think that's the thing that we do. People who are sort of desperately in a rush to raise capital is quite often a red flag. I really want to take a bit of time to get to know these people, understand them, and that might sound a bit kind of new age tech company, but I think it really is important. I don't necessarily have to like them hugely as individuals, and they don't have to like me as an individual, but we need to be able to respect each other. We need to be able to understand what everybody's goal is through this. And being of the more sort of financially minded folk in this world, I also like to see that there's some what I call money guys in the company, i.e. people who kind of understand that ultimately this comes down to there's got to be a blend between science, operation, and understanding that it is about money at the end of the day. I run a fund. I have to be able to demonstrate repeatedly that we can deliver good investment returns. So there's a number of different elements when going through due diligence, but the people are so critical, almost as much, if not more, than the physical manufacturing facility or cultivation site, whatever it might be. And going back to the point that you raised in talking about Little Green Farmer, for example, I think they're a brilliant example of a management team that is not just heavily invested themselves, and I don't just mean in capital terms, but I mean in terms of like in every fiber and every sinew of what they do. They're thinking about how do we grow this company, how do we do it sensibly, how do we actually run a real business? We're not just here to try and appease all these shareholders and provide a good capital markets narrative. They're like really interested in building an actual business. And there is that old adage of, if you build it, they will come. We're fortunate as investors right now that you can go and buy this stock on the market for a fraction of what it is, in my belief, is truly worth. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for value, and it's just amazing that you can buy a stock like that today for the current value. And
I agree, and I also wanted to circle back to that discussion of human capital being a critical part of sort of the business decisions, because it is in cannabis in particular, and I think all industries, but because of the life stage that cannabis companies are in right now, being able to look somebody in the eye and hear them speak back to you words that make sense about business structure and who is going to run this business and sort of how they're going to get to a final product that is sellable, and they have the skill sets to do that, is critical. And I tend to be a people person, background in marketing and communications. That's always been sort of key to what makes me tick. But having been in and out of the different sectors of finance for decades, that often is missed. So it's refreshing to hear you say it. And I think, in the case of a company like Little Green Pharma, indicative of why they are successful today. So
well, it's interesting you say that. I'm very similar to you. I'm kind of more of a people person. Relationships are kind of the backbone of pretty much everything I do. What I've had to do over the years is become much more proficient at the skills I've had to really learn are the sort of minutiae, of financial due diligence. I've had to really force myself to become much more detail oriented. But for example, the way that we've structured the board and the team at Fast Forward, which by the way is changing its name in the next few days to Seed Innovations, just to be a bit more, leave the legacy things that Fast Forward did in its former life in the past, and kind of refocus our narrative about what we really do, which is, largely we're cannabis oriented. We still carry assets that are not in the sector, but that's where we really are. But again, going back to the team of Fast Forward / Seed Innovations,
I love the fact that we're getting that news here today. So that's exciting. So congratulations on that innovation.
Yeah, well, thank you. It sort of feels like it's been a long time coming, but we're really happy about it. But it also reflects the fact that we have a team that, on one hand, we've got very, very good sort of people, for want of a better term. But we also have very, very good, hardcore financially minded people who their bread and butter is really getting into the nuts and bolts of the detail. And also, we have a very, very good legal team that supports us. And then, of course, the likes of Alfredo, who kind of crossed that divide a little bit. So I think we've got a really well-rounded set of abilities now, which allow us to kind of give a full coverage of companies in sectors that we really understand. And I think that's why we're making some really good investment decisions. LGP being one of them. Urox, our most recent investment in Germany, which again, I love that local manufacturing feel. I think it's really important. Europe loves a local hero. And I think, again, going back to LGP, I think that's something that they've done really well. And Urox, I think, will be incredibly successful. And of course, they already have both feet firmly on the ground in the largest global medical market, which is Germany, as far as we can see it. So, yeah, we're really pleased with the way things are going, and the balance of our fund is now starting to take shape in a much bigger way in that medical cannabis, pharmaceutical cannabis vertical that we really lean towards more than any other asset class right now.
Yeah, that's great. And so, as I wrap up the show, I always like to ask the crystal ball question, right? So we just found out that in the near term, we know that rebranding to Seed Innovations is in there, but as we look sort of forward with the company, whether that's a couple years or many more out, if you had to sort of put a prediction against it, how do you see the European market really evolving? Do you see it as continuing to be primarily a medicinal / pharmaceutical kind of space, or do you see it diversifying itself more broadly into, say, consumer packaged goods or an adult use space?
I think I always think of the market in sort of four verticals. I think of the pharmaceutical vertical, and I mean market authorized drugs with all the clinical trials that lead to a product that's available as a market authorized product. Then the medical cannabis market, which is effectively like magisterial preparations. It's what we're predominantly dealing with when we talk about medical cannabis companies. Then we have the CBD and nutraceutical space, and then of course you have the adult use space. So there's kind of four verticals there. What I think will happen in Europe, as is sort of already happened in North America, is we'll see that pharma and magisterial preparation market become one vertical, as I see it. Because either you'll be otherwise you're just a wholesaler of cannabis, right? So one way or another, you're going to have to become more of a pharmaceutical company, a real pharmaceutical company as we understand pharmaceutical companies today. But I think, just to confuse things slightly, the pharmaceutical vertical is changing a little bit to become a bit more plant-oriented and natural. So I think that's why that will compress. And then I think CBD, nutraceutical, and adult use will almost become one whole market in itself. And I think that will happen in Europe. I think predominantly we're going to see medical for at least the next 2 to 3 years. But I do think within that time, you're going to see one of the major European countries either agree to go down the route of recreational. I don't think it'll, as with all these things, it may be a year or more once they've actually pulled the trigger that the market actually becomes legally sound. But I definitely think we're going to see that in Europe. And I think all these companies that have proven themselves to be good operators, to be responsible operators, they're going to be first in the queue should they want to go down that route of being an adult use company. And of course, it would make sense that most of those companies end up having kind of two divisions, one that's geared towards leisure products and one that's geared towards medical pharmaceutical products. I think at the moment we recognize that there's a sort of 13 billion pound addressable market. Now again, it depends which source you read, but that's kind of like the lower end of what people are kind of predicting. When you look at that in the context of, say, alcohol, which is a $1.5 trillion industry, but you then look at the data associated with the reduced alcohol intake and the reduced alcohol sales in North America, particularly where cannabis is prevalent as a legal product, those markets are getting hit quite hard. So I think those numbers are pretty light, to be honest. And I think that cannabis is becoming not only an addition to adult leisure behavior, but I think it's going to potentially be instead of other products such as alcohol in due course. And I guess to kind of wrap up my feeling on that, I think if people sort of think that the market's got mature already in cannabis, I think they're sorely mistaken. I think we're very, very much still at the embryonic phase. We are, particularly in Europe. So the growth that's yet to come is, I think, staggering. And I think what will happen is it'll kind of creep up on people. It'll get forgotten. It'll go through phases of excited capital markets behavior. That's how people tend to measure these things, with sort of slightly more difficult times like we had for a lot of last year up until probably the last quarter. But we're in it for the long run, and we think that what I hope people will be saying in 2 or 3 years' time is, geez, I could have bought LGP for 70 cents. Like, I can't believe that you could have done that. You could have bought Fast Forward or Seed Innovations for 8p. That's what I really expect will happen, and that's not me trying to plug stocks here. That's just generally when you look at, you mentioned the internet before, the really big and good companies that have continued to go, they're now the biggest companies in the world. Now, I'm not saying that will be exactly the same with cannabis, but we will become, these cannabis companies are going to be the future Diageos of this world, Unilevers of this world. They really are. And I think the products are going to become mainstream in all of those verticals that I mentioned. And I'm really excited because for me, I just see another 10 years of sort of hypergrowth. So
and I am too. It's part of why we do this show, because I want to be part of that conversation 10 years from now, going, yeah, you remember when we had that conversation, and look at them now. So it's,
Chris, if you carry on,
great.
You'll have millions of followers by then. You'll have millions of people tuning in. I honestly think we're at that stage where some of these things, including things like podcasting and it's such a new media still that, again, I see these things very, very similar when you're talking about subjects that will become like a household subject for everyone to deal with. It's just the way these things are going to go. Yep. I see the same with other plant-based things as well. I see that with clean meats. I see that with nutraceutical products. So we're not alone, but I do think we have a very exciting time ahead.
Absolutely. And every 2 weeks we get a chance to talk more about it on the International Cannabis Conversation. Ed, I want to thank you for joining me today so much. It's been great. I have no doubt we're going to want to do this again in the coming months, because it seems like every time I turn around, you and Seed Innovations are doing something pretty cool, innovative, and interesting. So thanks to everybody out there in podcast land for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. I ask you every week. Don't make me repeat myself. I really want to have you tuning in all the time. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ed. And until next time, have a great week following the cannabis markets around the world.